On a warm October evening in 1989, the small town of Waynesboro, Georgia was winding down after a Friday night football game. The air still carried the smell of popcorn and stadium lights, and the streets hummed with the kind of energy that only high school sports can bring to a rural southern community. Parents were heading home. Teenagers were making plans. The Dairy Queen on Liberty Street was packed with kids still wearing their school colors, laughing too loud, living in that brief window between childhood and whatever came next. 4 of those teenagers, 4 boys who had grown up together, played ball together, gotten into the kind of harmless trouble that makes for good stories later, would not make it home that night. By sunrise, their families would be frantic. By Monday, the entire town would be searching. And for more than 2 decades, no one would know what happened to them. This is the story of a night that tore through Waynesboro like a wound that never closed. A night that left parents waiting by phones that never rang. A night that turned neighbors into suspects and silence into a kind of shared guilt. And this is the story of the man no one expected, whose arrest, more than 20 years later, would force an entire community to reckon with what they had allowed themselves to believe. Before we go any further into this case, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories reach. This channel exists to bring you true crime cases that small towns try to forget, stories that deserve to be remembered, no matter how much time has passed. Let me take you back to that night. October 13, 1989. A Friday. Waynesboro sits in Burke County, Georgia, about 40 miles south of Augusta. In 1989, it was a town of around 6,000 people. The kind of place where the high school was the center of gravity. Where the local paper ran photos of every homecoming court and every Little League championship. Where families went back generations, and people still talked about who your granddaddy was. The Waynesboro High School Blue Devils had just played their biggest rival that night. It wasn't a win, but it was close enough that no one left the stadium angry. The stands had been full. The band had played. The cheerleaders had done their routines under the lights. And when it was over, the parking lot emptied slowly, everyone lingering just a little longer, not quite ready to let the night end. Among the crowd were 4 boys. Freshmen and sophomores. 15 and 16 years old. Their names were Travis Milford, Eric Patterson, Damon Kersey, and Justin Cole. Travis was the quiet one. Dark hair, shy smile, the kind of kid who preferred listening to talking. He played trumpet in the band and spent most of his free time at his grandfather's farm, helping with the horses. His mother, Linda, would later say that Travis was the kind of boy who always called home if he was going to be late. Always. Eric was the opposite. Loud, confident, quick with a joke. He played baseball and basketball, though he wasn't a star at either. He had a habit of making people laugh even when they didn't want to. His father, Ron, worked at the paper mill. His mother, Sharon, worked the register at the Piggly Wiggly. Eric was their only child, and they doted on him in the quiet way that working-class parents do. Damon was the athlete. Tall, broad-shouldered, already being scouted for varsity football even though he was only a sophomore. He had the kind of easy charisma that made adults trust him and other kids want to be around him. His family ran a small construction business, and Damon spent his summers working alongside his uncle, learning to frame houses and pour concrete. He was good with his hands. Good with people. Justin was the youngest. Just 15. Small for his age, with a mop of blonde hair and a gap-toothed grin. He was Travis's cousin, and the two of them were inseparable. Justin loved comic books and horror movies and talking about things he'd read in encyclopedias. His grandmother, who raised him after his parents split, said Justin was going to be a teacher someday. He had that kind of patience. After the game, the 4 of them didn't go straight home. No one expected them to. It was a Friday night, and they were teenagers. They were supposed to be out. Supposed to be testing boundaries, making memories, figuring out who they were going to be. They left the stadium together, walking toward the Dairy Queen on Liberty Street. Witnesses would later say they saw the boys there around 9:30, maybe closer to 10. They ordered burgers and fries. They sat outside at one of the picnic tables, talking and laughing, unbothered by the cool October air. A few classmates stopped to talk. A teacher waved as she drove past. Everything seemed normal. But somewhere between 10:30 and 11 o'clock, the boys left the Dairy Queen. And after that, no one could say for sure where they went. One girl from school would later tell police she thought she saw them walking toward the old railroad tracks that ran behind the industrial park. Another kid said he might have seen them near the storage units on the edge of town. A truck driver passing through said he noticed a group of boys standing near the gas station on Highway 25, but he couldn't say for sure if it was them. By midnight, the boys should have been home. By 1 in the morning, their parents were calling each other. By 2, they were driving around town, checking the usual spots: the parking lot behind the bowling alley, the bridge over the creek, the clearing in the woods where kids sometimes went to drink beer they'd stolen from their parents' garages. By sunrise, 4 families were sitting in the Waynesboro Police Department, trying to explain to officers that their sons were missing. Missing persons cases in small towns operate on a different timeline than they do in cities. In a place like Waynesboro, if a teenager didn't come home, people noticed. Not just the parents. Everyone. By Saturday morning, the rumors had already started. People whispered in church parking lots and grocery store aisles. Some said the boys had run away. Others said they'd gotten into trouble and were hiding out. A few people, the ones who always assumed the worst, said something bad had happened. The police, for their part, were cautious. Chief Harold Tipton had been in law enforcement for 30 years, and he'd seen plenty of teenagers who disappeared for a weekend and came back with hangovers and bad excuses. He told the families to stay calm. He said the boys would turn up. He said kids did this kind of thing. But Linda Milford, Travis's mother, knew better. She stood in Chief Tipton's office that Saturday morning and told him her son would not just disappear. She told him Travis didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't get into trouble. She told him that if Travis wasn't home, it was because something had stopped him from getting there. Ron and Sharon Patterson said the same thing about Eric. Damon's parents, Diane and Marcus Kersey, said their son would never leave without telling someone. And Justin's grandmother, Margaret Cole, sat in that police station and cried, begging someone to believe her that something was wrong. By Saturday afternoon, Chief Tipton had organized a search. Volunteers gathered at the high school parking lot. Teachers, coaches, parents, neighbors. People who barely knew the boys showed up with flashlights and thermoses of coffee. They spread out across Waynesboro, checking every field, every ditch, every abandoned building. They walked the railroad tracks. They searched the woods near the reservoir. They knocked on doors and asked if anyone had seen anything. Nothing. Sunday came and went. Then Monday. Then Tuesday. The searches continued, but the initial hope began to curdle into something darker. People stopped saying the boys would turn up. They started saying things like, "Those poor families," and "I can't imagine." The Georgia Bureau of Investigation sent agents to Waynesboro. They interviewed classmates, teachers, anyone who might have seen the boys that night. They pulled phone records. They searched the boys' bedrooms, looking for notes, journals, anything that might explain where they'd gone. What they found was nothing. No signs of planning. No packed bags. No hints of trouble at home or at school. The boys had simply vanished. By the end of October, the case had made it into the Atlanta papers. The headlines were grim. 4 teens missing in small Georgia town. Families plead for information. The stories painted Waynesboro as a place paralyzed by fear, and in many ways, that was accurate. Parents stopped letting their kids walk home alone. People locked their doors at night. The football games continued, but the stands were quieter, the cheers more subdued. And still, no one knew what had happened. The investigation, such as it was, began to fracture. Some detectives believed the boys had run away. Others thought they'd been abducted. A few whispered about the possibility of foul play, though no one wanted to say that out loud. There were no bodies. No evidence of violence. No ransom demands. Just 4 empty bedrooms and 4 families who couldn't sleep. As the weeks turned into months, the case began to slip from the front pages. Life in Waynesboro didn't return to normal, how could it, but people learned to live with the uncertainty. They learned to talk around it. To avoid certain streets, certain memories, certain questions. The families, though, never stopped looking. Linda Milford put flyers up in every town within 100 miles. Sharon Patterson called the police station every week, asking if there were any updates. Damon Kersey hired a private investigator, though he found nothing the police hadn't already checked. Margaret Cole started a prayer group that met every Sunday, asking God to bring the boys home. But the boys didn't come home. Not that year. Not the next. Not for more than 20 years. What no one realized at the time was that the answer had been in Waynesboro all along. Living in plain sight. Going to work, going to church, living a life that looked, to everyone who knew him, utterly ordinary. The man who knew what happened to Travis, Eric, Damon, and Justin wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some drifter passing through town. He was someone people trusted. Someone they'd known for years. Someone who, decades later, would finally confess to a crime that had haunted an entire community. But before we get there, you need to understand what those years did to Waynesboro. What it means to live in a place where 4 children disappeared and no one could explain why. By 1990, the investigation had stalled. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation had moved on to other cases. Chief Tipton was still officially looking into leads, but there were fewer and fewer of those as time went on. The families were left with binders full of police reports, news clippings, and photographs of their sons that seemed to grow more distant with each passing year. Waynesboro, for its part, tried to move forward. New students enrolled at the high school. New families moved to town. People who had been teenagers in 1989 graduated, went to college, got married, had children of their own. The Dairy Queen on Liberty Street changed ownership twice. The old railroad tracks were torn up and replaced with a walking trail. The town grew, slowly, the way small southern towns do. But the absence of those 4 boys never quite faded. Their families made sure of that. Every year on October 13th, Linda Milford placed a memorial in the local paper. A photograph of Travis, smiling in his band uniform, alongside a short message, still missing. Still loved. Still searching. Sharon Patterson did the same for Eric. Damon Kersey organized a candlelight vigil every year at the high school, and people came, fewer each year, but they came. The younger generation, kids who hadn't been born in 1989, heard the story secondhand. They heard it from teachers, from older siblings, from parents who still remembered the searches. It became a kind of local legend. A cautionary tale. Don't go out alone at night. Don't trust strangers. Don't assume you're safe just because you're in a small town. But legends, by their nature, lose details. And as the years passed, people began to forget the specifics. They forgot which boy played trumpet. They forgot which one wanted to be a teacher. The 4 boys became a single story, a single tragedy, and the individuals they had been started to blur. To the detectives who stayed on the case, this was the hardest part. Not the lack of evidence, but the way the community's memory seemed to soften over time. People who had been interviewed in 1989 gave different answers in 1995. Witnesses who had been certain they saw the boys near the railroad tracks now weren't so sure. Details that had seemed important once were dismissed as irrelevant. By the late 90s, the Waynesboro Police Department had gone through 2 more chiefs. The case file, thick with reports, witness statements, and dead-end leads, was moved to a storage room in the basement of the station. It wasn't closed, officially, but it wasn't active either. It was in that liminal space where cold cases live, acknowledged but not pursued, remembered but not solved. And then, in 2003, something shifted. A new detective was hired by the Burke County Sheriff's Office. His name was Raymond Holt, and he was originally from South Carolina, a few hours east. Holt had spent 15 years working homicides in Charleston before moving to Georgia for what he thought would be a quieter job. He was in his mid-40s, soft-spoken, methodical. The kind of investigator who believed that most cases weren't solved by breakthroughs, but by patience. Holt didn't come to Waynesboro looking for the missing boys case. But within a few weeks of starting his new job, someone mentioned it to him. A deputy, making small talk, said something like, "You ever hear about those kids who disappeared back in '89?" Holt hadn't. But once he did, he couldn't let it go. He pulled the case file from storage. He spent weeks reading through the reports, the interviews, the search logs. He made notes. He drew timelines. He mapped out where the boys had been seen that night, where they might have gone, who they might have been with. What struck Holt most was how scattered the investigation had been. There were hundreds of leads, but very few of them had been followed through. Witnesses had been interviewed once and never contacted again. Tips had been logged but not pursued. The case had been worked hard in the first few months, but after that, it seemed like no one had known what to do next. Holt decided to start over. Not from scratch, exactly, but from a place of skepticism. He didn't assume the boys had run away. He didn't assume they'd been abducted. He didn't assume anything. He just started asking questions. He re-interviewed people who had been at the football game that night. He tracked down classmates who had moved away from Waynesboro, calling them at their new homes in Atlanta, in Florida, in North Carolina. He talked to teachers, coaches, parents of other students. He asked the same questions over and over. Did you see the boys? Did they seem upset? Did they mention going anywhere? Most of the answers were the same as they'd been in 1989. No one had seen anything unusual. No one remembered the boys being in trouble. But every once in a while, Holt would catch a detail that hadn't been in the original reports. A name that hadn't been mentioned. A place the boys might have gone. One of those details came from a woman named Cheryl Simmons, who had been a junior at Waynesboro High in 1989. She told Holt that she remembered seeing the boys after the football game, but not at the Dairy Queen. She said she'd seen them walking toward the industrial park, the area behind the old textile mill that had closed down a few years earlier. Holt asked why she hadn't mentioned this before. Cheryl said she had. She'd told a police officer in 1989, but no one had followed up. She assumed they'd checked it out. They hadn't. Holt drove out to the industrial park. It was mostly abandoned now, just a few rusted storage units and a cracked parking lot overgrown with weeds. He walked the area, looking for anything that might have been missed. He didn't find much. But the fact that this lead had been overlooked bothered him. He kept digging. Over the next few years, Holt quietly worked the case in between his other duties. He wasn't assigned to it, officially. The Burke County Sheriff's Office didn't have the resources to dedicate full-time to a 14-year-old missing persons case. But Holt worked it anyway, on his own time, in the evenings and on weekends. He became a familiar presence to the families. Linda Milford, who had spent more than a decade calling the police station with no results, was cautious at first. She'd dealt with detectives before. They always started out confident, promising answers, and then they disappeared. But Holt was different. He didn't make promises. He just asked questions. And he listened. Linda told him things she'd told other investigators before, but this time, Holt wrote them down differently. He asked follow-up questions. He wanted to know about Travis's friends, his habits, the places he liked to go. He wanted to know about the family. Were there any conflicts? Any reasons Travis might have wanted to leave? Linda told him no. Travis had been happy. He'd been looking forward to marching band competitions, to Thanksgiving with his grandparents, to Christmas. He'd been making plans. Kids who run away don't make plans. Holt believed her. Not because he was naive, but because the evidence supported it. There were no signs that any of the boys had wanted to leave. No packed bags. No withdrawn money. No notes. They had simply vanished. And vanishing, Holt knew, didn't just happen. Something, or someone, had made it happen. By 2005, Holt had assembled a list of people he wanted to re-interview. Most of them still lived in or around Waynesboro. A few had moved away but were willing to talk. Holt contacted them one by one, asking the same questions he'd asked before, looking for inconsistencies, looking for anything that didn't fit. One name kept coming up. Not as a suspect, exactly, but as someone who had been around that night. Someone who had known the boys. Someone who, according to several witnesses, had been seen near the industrial park around the time the boys disappeared. His name was Dale Pritchard. Dale was 51 years old in 2005. He'd lived in Waynesboro his entire life. In 1989, he'd been in his mid-30s, working as a maintenance supervisor at the old textile mill. He was known around town as a friendly guy. Quiet, but helpful. The kind of person who'd give you a ride if your car broke down, or lend you a tool if you needed one. He'd been interviewed in 1989, along with dozens of other people who had been near the industrial park that night. He'd told police he'd been working late, doing some repairs on one of the storage units. He said he hadn't seen the boys. Police had noted his statement and moved on. But as Holt dug deeper, he found something that bothered him. Dale's timeline didn't quite add up. He'd told police he'd left the industrial park around 10 o'clock that night. But a security log from the mill, one that had been overlooked in the original investigation, showed that Dale hadn't clocked out until nearly midnight. It was a small discrepancy. Maybe meaningless. But Holt had learned that small discrepancies were worth paying attention to. He decided to talk to Dale again. Holt drove out to Dale's house on a Saturday morning in the spring of 2006. Dale still lived in the same place he'd lived in 1989, a small ranch-style house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by pine trees. The yard was neat, the driveway empty except for an old pickup truck. Dale answered the door with a cup of coffee in his hand. He seemed surprised to see Holt, but not alarmed. He invited him in, offered him a seat at the kitchen table. Holt explained that he was reinvestigating the case, just going over old statements, seeing if anyone remembered anything new. Dale nodded. He said he understood. He said he wished he could help, but he didn't know anything. Holt asked about the night of October 13, 1989. Dale repeated the same story he'd told before. He'd been working late. He'd been alone. He hadn't seen the boys. Then Holt mentioned the security log. The one that showed Dale clocking out at midnight, not 10 o'clock. Dale paused. He set his coffee cup down. He said he must have been mistaken. It had been a long time ago. He probably just remembered it wrong. Holt didn't push. Not yet. He thanked Dale for his time and left. But the pause stuck with him. The way Dale had hesitated before answering. The way his demeanor had shifted, just slightly, when Holt mentioned the log. It wasn't proof of anything. But it was a crack. For the next several years, Holt kept an eye on Dale Pritchard. Not overtly. He didn't surveil him or follow him. But he made a point of staying aware. He asked around town, casually, if anyone had ever had issues with Dale. He checked if Dale had any kind of criminal record, any history of violence or erratic behavior. He found nothing. Dale was, by all accounts, a model citizen. He went to church. He volunteered at the community center. He helped coach Little League for a few years in the 90s. He'd been married once, briefly, in the early 80s, but his ex-wife had moved out of state and no one had heard from her in years. To everyone who knew him, Dale Pritchard was just a quiet, middle-aged man living a quiet life. There was nothing about him that suggested he was capable of harming anyone, let alone 4 teenage boys. But Holt had been a detective long enough to know that people were capable of hiding things. Sometimes for years. Sometimes forever. By 2008, the case had been cold for nearly 2 decades. The families were older now. Linda Milford's hair had gone gray. Sharon Patterson had developed health problems from the stress. Diane Kersey had moved to Florida, unable to stay in a town that reminded her of her son every single day. Margaret Cole, Justin's grandmother, had passed away in 2004, never knowing what happened to the boy she'd raised. The town, too, had changed. The old textile mill had been demolished. The industrial park had been cleared and turned into a small business complex. The high school had been renovated. The Dairy Queen on Liberty Street, where the boys had last been seen, had closed down and been replaced by a sandwich shop. But the story hadn't disappeared. It lived in the memory of anyone who had been there in 1989. It lived in the newspaper's archives, in the police files, in the hearts of the families who still waited for answers. And it lived, though no one knew it yet, in the conscience of Dale Pritchard. What no one understood at the time was that guilt has a weight. It sits on you. It changes the way you move through the world. And no matter how well you hide it, no matter how normal you seem, it's always there. By 2010, Dale was 56 years old. He'd retired from his job at the mill and was living on a modest pension. He spent most of his days at home, working in his garden, watching television, going to the grocery store. He had a few friends, mostly people he'd known for years, but he kept to himself more than he used to. To the people who saw him around town, Dale seemed fine. Maybe a little quieter. Maybe a little more withdrawn. But nothing alarming. Inside, though, something was shifting. It's impossible to say exactly when it started. Maybe it was the 20th anniversary of the boy's disappearance, marked by another memorial in the local paper. Maybe it was seeing Linda Milford at the grocery store one day, her face lined with 2 decades of grief. Maybe it was just the slow accumulation of time, the way secrets get heavier the longer you carry them. Whatever it was, by 2011, Dale Pritchard was beginning to unravel. He started drinking more. Not publicly, but at home, alone. He stopped going to church. He stopped answering his phone. His neighbors noticed that his yard, which had always been meticulously kept, was starting to look overgrown. One of those neighbors, a woman named Rita Lawson, later told police that she'd run into Dale at the post office in early 2012. She said he looked tired. She asked if he was okay, and he'd said something that stuck with her. He'd said, "Some things you can't outrun." Rita didn't think much of it at the time. She figured he was just having a bad day. But later, after everything came out, she would remember that moment and wonder if Dale had been trying to tell her something. By the summer of 2012, Dale had stopped leaving his house except for necessities. He'd lost weight. He looked older than his 58 years. People in town whispered that he was sick, maybe dying. A few people from his church stopped by to check on him, but he didn't answer the door. And then, in September of 2012, Dale Pritchard walked into the Burke County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak to Detective Raymond Holt. Holt wasn't in the office when Dale arrived. He was out following up on an unrelated case, something minor, a burglary at a hardware store. But the deputy at the front desk called him, said there was a man who needed to see him. Said it seemed urgent. Holt drove back to the station. When he walked in, Dale was sitting in the waiting area, hunched forward, his hands clasped between his knees. He looked up when Holt approached, and Holt saw something in his face that he recognized immediately. Fear. Exhaustion. Relief. Holt brought Dale into an interview room. He offered him water. Dale shook his head. He said he needed to talk, and he needed to talk now, before he changed his mind. Holt turned on the recorder. He stated the date and time. And then he asked Dale what he wanted to say. Dale took a breath. And then he told him. He said he'd been at the industrial park on October 13, 1989. He said he'd been working late, just like he'd told police before. But he hadn't been alone. The boys had shown up around 11 o'clock. He didn't know why. Maybe they were cutting through on their way home. Maybe they were just exploring. But they'd seen him, and he'd seen them. And they'd recognized him. Dale said one of the boys, he thought it was Travis, the quiet one, had asked what he was doing out there so late. Dale said he'd panicked. He didn't know why. He said he just felt this sudden wave of fear, this certainty that they were going to tell someone he'd been there, and he couldn't let that happen. He said he'd told the boys to come over, that he needed help with something. And they had. Because they trusted him. Because they'd known him their whole lives. Dale paused. He looked at Holt. He said, "They trusted me." Holt didn't say anything. He just waited. Dale said he'd led the boys into one of the storage units. He said it had happened fast. He said he didn't plan it. He said he'd grabbed a piece of rebar from the ground and he'd swung it, and one of the boys had gone down. And then the others had started yelling, and he'd panicked, and he'd swung again. And again. He said it was over in minutes. 4 boys. 4 lives. Gone. Dale said he'd wrapped their bodies in tarps. He said he'd loaded them into the back of his truck. He said he'd driven out to a construction site about 10 miles outside of town, a place his brother's company was working on. He said he'd buried them there, in a trench that was supposed to be filled with concrete the next morning. And then he'd gone home. And he'd waited. And no one had ever come. Holt sat across from Dale, listening, his face expressionless. He'd been a detective long enough to know that confessions didn't always feel like victories. Sometimes they just felt like endings. When Dale finished, Holt asked if he could show them where the bodies were. Dale said yes. The next day, Holt led a team of investigators to the construction site Dale had described. It was a small industrial complex now, built in the early 90s. The ground had been paved over years ago. But Dale was certain. He said he remembered the spot. He said he'd driven past it dozens of times over the years, knowing what was underneath. The excavation took 3 days. They brought in ground-penetrating radar. They broke through concrete. They dug carefully, methodically, knowing that if Dale was telling the truth, they were about to find 4 bodies that had been missing for 23 years. On the 3rd day, they found them. The remains were skeletal, but intact enough for identification. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. Travis Milford. Eric Patterson. Damon Kersey. Justin Cole. The news spread through Waynesboro like a shockwave. For 23 years, people had wondered. For 23 years, they'd speculated and hoped and feared. And now they knew. The boys hadn't run away. They hadn't been abducted by a stranger. They'd been killed by someone they knew. Someone who had lived among them all this time. Linda Milford received the call from Detective Holt on a Tuesday afternoon. She was at home, folding laundry. He told her they'd found Travis. He told her he was sorry it had taken so long. Linda didn't cry. Not then. She just sat down on the floor and stayed there for a long time, holding the phone, unable to move. Sharon Patterson was at work when she got the call. She left immediately, drove home, and sat in her driveway for an hour before she could bring herself to go inside and tell her husband. Damon Kersey was in Florida. Holt called her that evening. She listened quietly, thanked him, and hung up. Later, her neighbors would say they heard her screaming. Margaret Cole, Justin's grandmother, wasn't there to hear the news. But her daughter, Justin's aunt, stood in the cemetery where Margaret was buried and told her anyway. The arrest of Dale Pritchard was quiet. There were no sirens, no dramatic confrontation. He was taken into custody without incident, charged with 4 counts of murder. He was held without bail. The town of Waynesboro didn't know what to feel. There was relief, in a way. Relief that the mystery was over. Relief that the families finally had answers. But there was also rage. Rage that Dale had lived freely for 23 years while those boys were buried under concrete. Rage that he'd gone to church, coached Little League, walked the same streets as the families who were searching for their sons. And there was something else, too. Something harder to name. A kind of collective guilt. Because everyone had known Dale. Everyone had trusted him. And no one had suspected a thing. The trial was set for the spring of 2013. Dale pleaded guilty. He didn't contest the charges. He didn't try to claim self-defense or accident. He just admitted what he'd done. The courtroom was packed the day of his sentencing. The families sat in the front row. Linda Milford wore a photograph of Travis pinned to her shirt. Sharon Patterson held Ron's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Damon Kersey flew in from Florida. Justin's aunt sat beside them, her hand on the empty seat where Margaret would have been. The judge asked if anyone wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Linda stood. She walked to the podium. She didn't look at Dale. She said, "You took my son. You took his future. You took everything he could have been. And then you let me spend 23 years wondering if he was still alive somewhere, if he was suffering, if he needed me. You let me hope. And that's worse than anything." She sat down. Sharon stood next. She said, "I used to see you around town. At the grocery store. At the post office. And you'd smile at me. Like you didn't know. Like you hadn't destroyed my life. I hate you. But more than that, I hate that I didn't know. That none of us knew." Diane spoke next. She said, my son was 15 years old. He wanted to play college football. He wanted to build houses like his uncle. He wanted to have a family someday. And you took that. For what? Because you panicked? Because you were scared? You don't get to be scared. You don't get to feel anything. Justin's aunt was the last to speak. She said, "My mother died not knowing what happened to her grandson. She prayed every single day for 20 years that he'd come home. And he never did. Because of you. I hope you live a long time. I hope you have to think about what you did every single day for the rest of your life." The judge sentenced Dale Pritchard to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison. Dale, for his part, said nothing. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his head down, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally set it down. In the weeks after the sentencing, Waynesboro tried to process what had happened. The local paper ran a series of articles about the case, about the investigation, about the families. The high school held a memorial service. 4 trees were planted on the school grounds, 1 for each boy. The families, for their part, were left with something they hadn't had in 23 years, certainty. It wasn't closure, they would all say later, doesn't exist. But it was an answer. And after so long, an answer was something. Linda Milford visited Travis's grave every week. It was a small plot in the Waynesboro cemetery, under a dogwood tree. The headstone was simple, Travis Allen Milford. 1974 to 1989. Beloved son. She would sit there and talk to him. She'd tell him about her week, about the weather, about the neighbors. She'd tell him she was sorry it took so long to bring him home. Sharon Patterson started a scholarship fund in Eric's name. It was for students who wanted to play baseball or basketball, kids who had Eric's kind of energy and humor. Every year, she'd present the award at the high school's athletic banquet, and every year, she'd tell the recipients a little bit about her son. About how he made people laugh. About how he would have been proud to know he was still helping kids pursue their dreams. Damon Kersey stayed in Florida, but she came back to Waynesboro twice a year. Once for the anniversary of Damon's death, and once for his birthday. She'd visit his grave, spend time with the other families, and then leave again. She told people that Georgia held too many ghosts for her to stay, but she couldn't abandon her son completely. Justin's aunt, Rebecca, became an advocate for families of missing persons. She worked with organizations across Georgia, helping other families navigate the impossible terrain of not knowing. She'd tell them about Margaret, about how her mother had died without answers, and she'd tell them about the 23 years her family had spent in limbo. She'd tell them not to give up hope, but also to prepare themselves for the long road ahead. Detective Raymond Holt continued working for the Burke County Sheriff's Office for another 5 years. He never sought recognition for solving the case. When reporters asked him about it, he'd say he was just doing his job. But privately, to the families, he'd say that he wished he'd found the answers sooner. That 23 years was too long. Linda told him once that he'd given her something she thought she'd never have, the ability to bury her son. To know where he was. To stop wondering. Holt had nodded, but he'd also said, "I'm sorry it took so long." Linda had replied, "You're the only one who didn't give up." And that, in the end, was what mattered. The question that haunted Waynesboro in the years after Dale's confession wasn't just what he'd done, but why he'd confessed. Why, after 23 years of silence, had he walked into that police station and told the truth? Some people said it was guilt. That he couldn't live with what he'd done anymore. Others said it was fear, that he knew Detective Holt was closing in, that it was only a matter of time before he was caught. But those who knew Dale, or thought they knew him, wondered if it was something else. Something quieter, more human. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the realization that the weight of his secret was heavier than the consequences of confessing. Maybe it was seeing the families, year after year, still searching, still hoping, and knowing that he could end their suffering with a single conversation. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he just couldn't be Dale Pritchard, the friendly maintenance worker, the quiet neighbor, the helpful guy, anymore. Maybe he needed to become what he actually was, a man who had killed 4 boys and spent 2 decades pretending it hadn't happened. Whatever the reason, the confession changed everything. For the families, for the town, for everyone who had lived with the question of what happened that October night in 1989. But it didn't change the past. It didn't bring the boys back. It didn't give Linda another chance to hear Travis play trumpet, or give Sharon another chance to hear Eric's jokes, or give Diane another chance to watch Damon play football, or give Margaret another chance to see Justin grow up. It just gave them an ending. And after 23 years, that had to be enough. The story of Travis, Eric, Damon, and Justin didn't end with Dale Pritchard's confession. It continued in the way all tragedies continue, in the lives that were shaped by it, in the memories that refused to fade, in the lessons that were learned too late. For the people of Waynesboro, the case became a kind of marker. A before and after. There was the town they'd been before October 13, 1989, a place where people left their doors unlocked, where teenagers walked home alone, where everyone trusted their neighbors. And then there was the town they became after, a place that understood that trust could be misplaced, that evil didn't always look like a stranger, that the people you knew could hide things you'd never imagine. The 4 boys became more than a memory. They became a reminder. A reminder to pay attention. To ask questions. To not assume that because someone seems normal, they are safe. But they were also remembered as more than victims. They were remembered as sons, as friends, as kids who had lives and dreams and futures that were stolen from them. They were remembered for the things they loved, trumpet and baseball and football and comic books. They were remembered for the way they laughed, the way they talked, the way they moved through the world before someone decided they didn't deserve to anymore. In 2014, the town of Waynesboro erected a memorial in the park near the high school. It was a simple stone marker with 4 names engraved on it: Travis Milford, Eric Patterson, Damon Kersey, Justin Cole. Beneath their names was a single line: "Gone but never forgotten." The families gathered for the dedication. It was a cold November day, the kind of day where the sky is gray and heavy and the air smells like rain. Linda stood in front of the memorial and traced Travis's name with her finger. Sharon laid flowers at the base. Diane stood with her hand on the stone, her head bowed. Rebecca read a poem her mother had written years ago, a prayer for Justin to come home. People from town came. Teachers who had taught the boys. Classmates who had known them. Neighbors who had searched for them. They stood quietly, honoring the lives that had been cut short, honoring the families who had never stopped fighting for answers. And in that moment, Waynesboro did what small towns do best. It came together. It remembered. It refused to let those 4 boys disappear again. Dale Pritchard died in prison in 2019. He was 65 years old. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack. The families were notified, but none of them attended his funeral. There was no funeral, actually. His body was cremated, and his ashes were disposed of without ceremony. When Linda Milford heard the news, she felt nothing. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Just a kind of quiet acknowledgement that the man who had killed her son no longer existed in the world. Sharon said she wished she could say she was glad he was dead, but mostly she just felt tired. Diane said she hoped, wherever he was finally being held accountable for what he'd done. Rebecca said she didn't believe in hell, but if it existed, Dale Pritchard was there. The case, officially, was closed. But the story wasn't over. It lived on in the way all stories of loss and injustice live on, in the people who refused to forget, in the families who kept telling their sons stories, in the town that learned to live with the knowledge of what had happened within its borders. And it lived on in the work of people like Detective Holt, who understood that justice delayed is still justice. That answers, even decades late, still matter. That the truth, no matter how painful, is better than silence. In 2023, on the 34th anniversary of the boys' disappearance, a documentary crew came to Waynesboro. They interviewed the families, the detectives, people who had been there. They filmed the memorial in the park. They told the story of 4 boys who went to a football game and never came home, and the man who had taken them away. Linda Milford sat for an interview. She was 73 years old by then. Her hair was white. Her hands shook slightly when she held the photograph of Travis. But her voice was steady. She said, "I want people to know that Travis wasn't just a victim. He was a person. He had a life. He mattered. They all mattered. And even though they've been gone for more than 30 years, they still matter. That's what I want people to remember." The documentary aired later that year. Millions of people watched it. They heard the story. They saw the town. They met the families. And for a brief moment, Travis, Eric, Damon, and Justin were no longer just names on a memorial stone. They were real again. They were remembered. Cold cases are different from other crimes. They stretch across time in a way that changes everyone they touch. The victims stay frozen at the age they were when they died. But the families grow older. The investigators retire. The towns move on. And the truth, if it comes at all, arrives so late that it feels almost like fiction. But it isn't fiction. It's real. It's lives interrupted, families destroyed, communities scarred. And the fact that it takes decades to solve doesn't make it any less important. The story of Travis, Eric, Damon, and Justin is one of thousands. Thousands of cold cases across America, sitting in file cabinets, waiting for someone to care enough to keep looking. Waiting for a detective like Raymond Holt who refuses to let time erase the truth. Waiting for a family member who won't stop asking questions. Waiting for a guilty conscience to finally break. These stories matter because the people in them matter. Because every unsolved case is a person whose life was taken, a family whose grief never ends, a community that never fully heals. And these stories matter because they remind us that justice doesn't have an expiration date. That no matter how much time passes, the truth is still the truth. That the dead still deserve to be honored. That the living still deserve answers. Waynesboro, Georgia, is a small town. You could drive through it in 10 minutes and never know what happened there in 1989. You'd see the high school, the churches, the neat rows of houses. You'd see people going about their lives, working, raising families, growing old. But if you stopped, if you walked through the park near the high school, if you saw the memorial stone with 4 names on it, if you asked someone who lived there, someone old enough to remember, they'd tell you the story. They'd tell you about the night 4 boys disappeared. About the decades of searching. About the man no one suspected. About the confession that finally brought them home. And they'd tell you that those boys are still loved. Still missed. Still remembered. Because in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. To be remembered. To have our lives mean something, even after they're gone. Travis Milford wanted to be a musician. Eric Patterson wanted to make people laugh. Damon Kersey wanted to build things. Justin Cole wanted to teach. They never got the chance. But their stories are still being told. And as long as someone is telling them, they're still here. Rest in peace, Travis. Rest in peace, Eric. Rest in peace, Damon. Rest in peace, Justin. You deserved so much more than what happened to you. But you got something, eventually. You got the truth. You got justice. And you got people who refuse to forget you. That's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something. The people who stayed with this story to the very end are exactly the ones this channel exists for. You already understand why these stories matter. You understand that the passage of time doesn't diminish the value of a life, or the importance of truth, or the need for justice. And you understand that these stories, these forgotten cases from small towns across America, deserve to be told. Because these aren't just stories. They're people. Real people who lived and loved and were taken too soon. Real families who spent decades in pain. Real communities that had to learn to live with unanswered questions. And when we remember them, when we listen to their stories, when we refuse to let them be forgotten, we give them something they were denied in life. We give them a voice. We give them meaning. We give them a place in the world that says, you mattered. You still matter. What part of Travis, Eric, Damon, and Justin's story affected you the most? Was it the 23 years of silence? The families who never stopped searching? The confession that came so late? Drop a comment and let me know. And please, If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. These cases exist to make sure the truth is never forgotten. I'll see you in the next one.